to November 1946. Leipzig, Soviet zone. A man named Karl sat at a kitchen table and wrote one line that he could not say aloud. "We live because I do not ask what he did in his uniform." He wrote it in a school notebook taken from a bombed-out classroom. He wrote it between a list of ration points and the address of a Soviet run office on Bruderstrasse. He wrote it while his mother boiled beets with cabbage and a Soviet officer in his undershirt mended a boot near the stove. He wrote it during curfew hours when the streets were empty, the blackout curtains hung, and the city smelled like coal dust and wet brick. That single sentence was the story. The story of surviving in the German ruins by learning the arithmetic of silence. 19. April 1945. The first Soviet scouts entered Leipzig from the east. The city had been bombed into a geometry of broken walls and sharp horizons. Rail lines twisted like wire. Windows without glass became frames for the sky. The women called it Trümmer, rubble. They lifted bricks and stacked them into neat pyramids as if order itself could feed them. Allied occupation reports from that week describe a city stunned into compliance. Curfew at 8 p.m. Loudspeakers ordered weapons to be turned in at designated points. The remnants of the local police stood with white armbands. People put on armbands they had hidden red for anti-fascists, white for surrendering police, and waited to see who had authority. The Soviet military administration in Germany, SED, arrived with seal stamps and carbines. It announced order. It announced order. It announced requisitions. It announced that the war had been won and that fascism would be eradicated. The mathematics of authority fell like a grid over the city. Karl was 19. He had come home from the German army with frostbitten feet and a notebook of names of the missing. His father had not come home from the east. The last Feldpost letter was from November 1942. The postmistress had murmured, "Stalingrad," without meeting his eyes. Karl joined the other men with shovels and the women with carts. He pulled beams from the ruins of the printing house on Straße, which the city council had renamed. New names for old streets, old bricks for new walls. The arithmetic of change. The Trümmerfrauen lifted the city by hand. Their headscarves were the uniform of the unarmed. They filled crates with a rhythm that became a chant. 1 brick, 2 bricks, 3. Allied intelligence summaries note the speed with which German municipal workers and committees restarted. The same skills that had kept an authoritarian state running now kept a broken city alive. That was the paradox. The same hands that had lifted party banners now lifted bricks. Curfew, then survival. Fear of retribution sharpened into a daily schedule. Women kept to routes they could run. Men shaved before dawn so they would look like officials if questioned. Karl learned the mathematics of distance from a patrol. 10 minutes at a walk, 5 at a trot, 3 if you knew the alley by the bakery. There are oral histories in the Bundesarchiv from that spring. A woman says, "He wore the star and the medals. He could requisition a horse. He requisitioned me." Another says nothing but shows a wedding ring on a string around her neck. Those testimonies are not aligned with slogans. They are not about liberation or vengeance. They are about the arithmetic of personal risk and the way women calculated it every hour. Marta, Karl's mother, did not tell Karl everything. She told him where the flour was hidden in the coal bin. She told him to speak slowly to the men with pistols. She told him to be helpful and to be invisible. She told him not to take a position. Positions got you noticed. Getting noticed got you a file. The hunger winter of 1946-47 did not begin with snow. It began with bad harvests and freight cars stuck on iced tracks. It began with electricity rationing charts that clipped off the city's light for hours. It began with figures. 1050 calories a day for an adult in Leipzig if the ration office did not fall behind. The mathematics of nutrition was printed on small rectangles of card and turned into line length at the shop. In Karl's notebook, ration points ran like columns beside his line about the Soviet officer. 50 grams of bread per day, 30 grams of fat per week. Ersatz coffee measured in spoonfuls of roasted barley. Black market prices written in pencil because they changed too fast to ink. 1 American cigarette equaled 2 eggs. A pair of shoes equaled 20 cigarettes. The cigarettes were money because they could be divided evenly and burned. At the Hauptbahnhof, a theatre of transactions formed under the broken clock. Men with suitcases sold currencies that existed in imagination as much as law. Russians traded rationed vodka for salvaged typewriters. Displaced persons from the East traded Antwerp diamonds or what they claimed were diamonds for whatever could be eaten. Then they moved on. They lived in camps on the edge of town or in the barracks outside Halle. Allied reports note fights over beds, over soap, over blankets, over the right to use a pump. The math of hunger divided into zones. The British zone had tinned meat and people with bicycles. The American zone had cigarettes and a sense that the war had stopped. The Soviet zone had slogans and a sense that it had not. Reports written by the U.S. Office of Military Government describe police who could be bought by a slab of cured pork. S-MAD bulletins describe police who needed no bribes because they had quotas. Buchenwald stood not far away near Weimar. The gate that said Jedem das Sein in iron had let out those who were still alive in April 1945. Trucks rolled past Leipzig carrying men who looked like they had been erased and then drawn again by an unskilled hand. People pretended not to see. People stared. People gave bread. People told their children to look away. The mathematics of distance between a camp and a town was measured in miles and in the refusal to count. In the U.S. zone, Jewish survivors were gathered into DP camps. Feldafing, Landsberg, Zeilsheim. Allied occupation reports described kitchens that made smell a weapon against nausea. They made stews, and they made a politics of survival that did not include Germans. On the edge of Leipzig, a camp held Polish and Ukrainian forced laborers waiting to go home, or not to go home, or not to go home. Soviet filtration units looked for deserters and for enemies, screens inside screens. The Allied reports note that some men cut their arms so that scars would look like battle, not labor. Karl saw the buses, and in his notebook he wrote, "They have numbers on their arms. We have numbers on paper." He wrote the name of a Soviet officer, then crossed it out. The man's name was Captain Anatoly Serebriakov. He was 32 when he came to Leipzig, older than Karl by 13 years. He wore his uniform like a shield and a chain. He had been in the Don Basin, at the crossing of the Bug, in the long retaking of places that had different names depending on who wrote the maps. He met Marta because she stood up straight in a line at the requisition office and could look him in the eye. She was 38. Her hair had the grey of ashes, not age. He asked for an interpreter. She said, in bad Russian learned from the factory floor during the war, "I am enough." The first exchange was about coal. The second was about potatoes. The third was about potatoes. The third was about a broken water pump that he could repair. The fourth was about a room in an apartment that had no intact doors. Fraternization was a word on paper. SMAD orders forbade certain kinds of contact, and then allowed them in practice because humans under stress will find each other. He was not supposed to be human. He was supposed to be a tool of policy. He was both. The mathematics of intimacy under occupation had variables: power, hunger, fear, the need to make a next day exist. It was not a romance novel. It was a ledger that had warmth in it. He brought bread that had been baked at a Soviet field kitchen. He brought tinned fish labeled in Cyrillic that tasted like salt and metal. He brought stories in a language Karl did not speak. He brought a holster with a pistol in it. He brought a way to believe that a woman with a son could be seen. Karl watched the way the uniform filled the doorway. He watched the way his mother spoke softer when the officer came. He watched the way the officer's hands moved slowly when he reached for anything in the room, slow so as not to startle. Slow, as if every movement had to be part of an instruction. Denazification came as paper. Fragebogen, 16 pages in the US zone, shorter in the British, different in the French, and in the Soviet zone a separate apparatus that called itself anti-fascist cleansing. Germans wrote their past into boxes. They wrote Mitläufer instead of Belastet. They wrote joined in 1937 to keep job. They wrote joined in 1937 to keep job. In the American zone, Sprüchkammern. In the American zone, Sprüchkammern, the tribunals classified millions. Category 1, major offenders, Hauptschuldig. Category 2, offenders, Belastet. Category 3, lesser offenders, Minder Belastet. Category 4, followers, Mitläufer. Category 4, exonerated, Entlastet. The mathematics of guilt became an administrative science. Out of more than 3 million who filed, a fraction were punished hard. The curve bent toward categories that allowed men and women to return to desks and to factory floors. Allied statistics show that by 1948, in the American zone, less than 1% were classed as Category I. Administrative demands, Cold War forecasts, and human networks did what war crimes talk could not. They put people back to work. In the Soviet zone, purges removed Nazis from positions and replaced them with anti-fascists and people trusted by Semnad or the new Socialist Unity Party, the SED. Many were honest. Many were opportunists. Many had also been Mitläufer, but now had better sponsors. There were lists. There were quotas. There were people who disappeared into special camps, some of them on the grounds of former concentration camps. The mathematics of guilt here did not have 5 categories. It had a dichotomy and a file number. In Karl's family, guilt had a different ledger. His father had worn a uniform with a death's head on the collar and gone east and not returned. The letter said he served in a supply unit. The photos suggested something else. The man who stayed, the Soviet officer, also wore a uniform. It had a red star and a past that could not be asked. To ask was to accuse. To accuse was to lose bread. The arithmetic of bread prevented questions. Hunger calibrated memory. The winter of 1946–47 was a season of cues that began in the dark. The river froze. The pipes cracked. The electricity went out. In Karl's notebook, there were calculations: 20 minutes to walk to the coal yard, 60 minutes to stand, 15 minutes to argue, 30 minutes to carry a sack, 50 minutes to carry a sack, 50 minutes to recover from the weight. He wrote how many calories a day were on the ration card, and how many a man needed to swing a sledgehammer. He wrote, "I short by 400. He wrote the numbers as if he could summon calories by doing their arithmetic. He wrote prices in cigarettes, eggs, 2, meat, 10, a bicycle, 200, a night with a woman, variable. He did not buy that last item. He did hear the men boasting. He did hear men cry. He did hear men cry. He did hear women shout. None of these stories appeared in occupation reports with names, only numbers and trends. Displaced persons walked through the city like evidence. Polish women who had worked in the chemical plant marched back to Poland with bundles on their backs and postcards of Leipzig churches rolled into their sleeves. Frenchmen left singing songs about Paris. Ukrainians left in quiet groups, watched by Soviet officers with lists. Some jumped from trains. There are Allied intelligence summaries that list the numbers, repatriated, refusing repatriation, suicides at the prospect of return. The categories are the cold arithmetic of tragedy. The city received its own displaced. Expellees came from Silesia, from Pomerania, from the Sudetenland. They arrived with barrels and baby carriages dragging their lives on wheels that squealed. They were Germans and strangers. They filled rooms in buildings already divided into rooms too small to be named. The municipal authorities issued occupancy orders. Your apartment now held a family from Breslau. Your kitchen now had 2 pots, your stove 2 afternoons. The mathematics of space became a science of resentment. Oral histories record phrases like, "They came with lice," and "They looked down on us." The resentment ran both ways. Karl's cousin Hans wrote from Hanover in 1947 that the British zone had more. Not plenty, more. He had heard of American trucks with laughter coming from the cab. He wrote about how schoolchildren got chocolate bars from men in uniforms who smiled with all their teeth. Karl could not imagine such a smile. In 1947, Captain Serebriakov left the field and entered the Soviet Joint Stock Company, a SAG, taking the place of a uniformed man with a civilian jacket cut by the same tailor. The factory in Leipzig that made machine tools now paid its profits to the Soviet Union as reparations. Machinery rolled east. Drawings rolled east. Drawings rolled east. Men who had drawn them did not. The factory kept making things because it had to. The officer had paperwork now instead of a rifle. He was demobilized on paper, not in life. He wore his officer's boots. He visited the flat on Bruderstrasse with a scarf instead of a cap. He asked Marta to marry him without a ceremony. He had a wife in Russia who had died. He had a daughter he had not seen since 1941. Or perhaps he had neither. When Karl asked, he did not answer. When Karl did not ask, he stayed. The arithmetic of the family did not include formal sums. In the US zone, denazification hearings became routine. Spruchkammer sessions in Munich and Stuttgart and Wiesbaden turned the past into forms. The files are thick at the Bundesarchiv. Men presented affidavits from neighbors. They presented certificates that said they had sheltered a Jew, that they had donated to the church, that they had served reluctantly. Many were telling partial truths. The statistics of leniency creep like ivy across the years 1946 to 1948. So do the statistics of need. Engineers, policemen, teachers. The American military government realized that a denazified city could not be a functioning city if nobody knew how to keep the water clean. In the Soviet zone, the SED fused the communists and the Social Democrats under pressure. Land reform took place through expropriation. Junkerland in Bauernhand. Great estates were broken and handed out, except that the tools to run them had gone, and the men who knew the fields were in war graves. The question of who had been a Nazi was answered by who was useful now and who was not. Karl's neighbor, who had run a party cell in the factory, now ran the block's People's Police Auxiliary. The man who had been a party member to keep his job was sent to a special camp where he died of dysentery in 1947. The mathematics of guilt felt arbitrary on the ground. It looked precise on SMAD spreadsheets, arrests, purges, replacements. The Cold War arrived as a series of abbreviations: SEDI, CDU, SPD, KPD, SMAD, OM-GUS. It arrived as currency. 20. June 1948 in the Western zones, the Deutsche Mark replaced the Reichsmark. Shop windows emptied and then filled. Within days, the black market shifted. The arithmetic of cigarettes gave way to the arithmetic of cash that held. Men who had saved materials sold them at new prices. The West took shipments from across the Atlantic under a new plan named for an American. Trucks with ECA painted on the side rolled into towns. Marshall Plan aid, flour, canned meat, machinery, fertilizer, ideas. Karl heard about it through radio and letters. RIAS. Berlin carried men's voices that sounded like his cousins. They told him about shop fronts with goods. They told him about a new smell in town, soap that smelled like lemons. They told him about trade unions that negotiated wages and about a Christian Democrat with glasses who spoke like a teacher. He wrote the letters into his notebook, numbers, facts, names. It was his way of believing. 3 days after the Western currency reform, the East introduced its own. June 23, 1948. The East mark. Old Reichsmarks stamped with stickers. New bills not yet printed turned old money into controlled money. The mathematics of value split along a line that ran through families, fields, and cities. The Berlin blockade made the split visible in the sky. Airplanes became the mathematics of provision. In the West, they landed every 3 minutes on concrete. In the East, trains stood still. People named the American pilot Onkel Wackel Propeller and gave thanks by waving from balconies where they had waved flags for other men in uniforms 15 years before. Karl stood on a roof and saw planes on the horizon like polka dots. The family's arithmetic grew complicated. Captain Serebliakov, the man who had become Anatoly at the stove, now ran a section at the SAG that liaised with German engineers. He was the connection between a desk in Moscow and a lathe in Leipzig. He brought home stories of production norms and of men who failed them. Sabotage was a word in his reports. It was a charge that could mean a broken belt or a refusal to salute. He was not a monster. He was a man with a pen. He was a man who had a past that now expressed itself in memoranda. The mathematics of his job included how many men could be changed from liabilities into allies by a good deal. He was good at deals. He and Marta had a daughter in 1949. They named her Anja. She was born into the Soviet occupation's last year and into the GDR's first autumn. East Germany declared itself anti-fascist and announced a new beginning. West Germany declared itself democratic and announced a new beginning. Both used words from the same dictionary with different definitions. Karl wrote in his notebook, "We have 2 Germanys now. We did not vote for them. They are pieces in a larger division." In the West, the Wirtschaftswunder gathered itself like a muscle under skin. Numbers tell the story. Industrial output up 50% by 1952 compared to 1936 levels. Marshall Plan aid to West Germany hovering around 1.4 billion by 1952. The currency reform working like a lever. The arithmetic of growth created headlines and noise. Factories hummed. New buildings rose. The rubble did not vanish, but it was displaced by scaffolding. In the East, the economy rebuilt under different banners. Reparations took steel and skilled men east. New factories opened under new names: VEB, Volkseigener Betrieb, the people's own enterprise. The phrase sounded like justice. The plant managers' offices looked like old offices with new portraits on the wall. Karl got a job in a factory that made machine tools. He started as a cleaner, then moved to a bench where he measured grooves in shafts. He had a talent for precision. He had the demeanor of a man who could not be broken by boredom. He joined a union because to not join was to be noticed. He went to meetings, he clapped, he wrote notes at home that could not be clapped for. Karl's notebook from 1951 has long columns on left margins, kilowatt hours, steel quotas, absenteeism rates. Then, on the right, words, silence, compromise, bargains. He understood that the new democracy, East or West, rested on such bargains. In the West, the bargain was, do not ask too many questions about who did what in 1942, and you can have a refrigerator in 1955. In the East, the bargain was, say the correct words about anti-fascism, and we will not ask about the men you knew in 1943. In both cases, history was a currency that could buy you comfort if you spent it carefully. Schoolbooks came, printed on cheap paper, illustrated with strong arms and smokestacks. In the East, they told children that fascism had been the work of a clique of capitalists. They told them the people had resisted. They highlighted 1933, 1945, and a class struggle that had one path and one end. They taught the Bombenkrieg, the bombing war, in numbers that showed German suffering. They did not dwell on what had happened to Jews in German streets. They did not dwell on what had been done in names like the one on Karl's father's dog tag. Oral histories collected in the 1990s note how few remembered in detail the deportation of their Jewish neighbors. They remembered names like Frau Braun, who had a sewing shop, but they remembered them as absences that had to be explained away or softened. They moved, they said. They were resettled, they said. Language became another way to ration truth. In 1952, the border hardened. Stacheldraft. Barbed wire. Signs. Guards. Karl crossed into the West for the last time in June of that year to attend a funeral in Kassel. He walked past trees with posters stapled to them. Rias hetzt, they read. IIS in sights. He drank a beer with his cousin Hans, who had a job at a plant that made bearings. The bar had a jukebox. The arithmetic of choice spoke in the clink of coins and the selection of songs. Then Karl went back east because the window he had would not stay open forever. Anatoly got a new position that summer, liaison to the People's Police on economic offences. He took a new caution into the apartment. He turned the radio down. He said, "We must be careful," as if that were new. Karl wrote in the notebook, "Careful is the only way." 17 June 1953. Leipzig. Workers gathered at the Marktplatz. The protest began in Berlin with construction workers and spread like a line of spilled ink. They shouted for lower norms. They shouted for freedom. They shouted because the carefulness had broken along a fault in a man's stomach where hunger lived. Karl's factory sent a delegation to the city centre. He went because the men at the bench looked at him and because he had learned to be where the count took place. The mathematics of the crowd was simple. A few thousand at first, then more. Then suddenly men with batons, and then suddenly tanks. Soviet T-34s moved like habit, slow and inexorable. The decision to protest was reversed by a gear. The main squares emptied. The arrests began. The radio announced a conspiracy. The aftermath was measured in detained men and in the number of whispered stories that began, "I was there." Anatoly came home that night, late and quietly furious. He did not say at whom. He put his cap on the table and looked at it for a long time. He was the Soviet who stayed, and the Soviet who stayed Soviet. He had read reports. He had written one while a man leaned over his desk and breathed vodka and fear. Karl did not ask. He carried the syllables of his anger like a bucket of coal to the stove and dumped them into his pencil and wrote, "We live because I do not ask." The mathematics of surveillance shaped the city the way rain shapes a hillside. People spoke in their kitchens with faucets running because they believed the water would carry away words. Neighbors were selected for reliability, then trained to be more reliable. The Stasi was not yet a word everyone used, but it existed like a fungus in the dark. People learned to clean around it without touching it. The Soviet officer in the house had become a triangle. One point was the man who had saved them during the hunger winter with a bag of potatoes found somewhere in a system where things went missing. One point was the man in a uniform who could get them into trouble. One point was the man who came home and read Pushkin to a child in a language she would never speak well and smiled as if words could make a country of 3 people. The triangles resolved into a shape that only made sense from above, like a diagram in an Allied intelligence summary of a unit's organization that looks logical until you see the men on the ground. In 1956, Karl left. He did not run. He walked. He took a train to Berlin with a work permit and a suitcase half full. He walked across a street to the other side, at a place where the crossing was still a formality. He had learned to do things at the last possible moment, and this was such a moment. He arrived in Hanover in July. The city had new buildings that did not pretend to be old. The streets had asphalt that looked black in the rain. The ration cards were gone. Shops had goods that stayed in the window long enough for the dust to settle on them. He got a job at a factory that made presses. He started as a broom and became a man with a spanner by 1958. He joined a union that argued about wages. He voted in an election in 1957 and put his ballot in a box that had observers. He did not clap at the end. He nodded to himself. He wrote in his notebook, "Here the bargain is open." He sent money back east through roundabout routes. He sent stockings for his mother and chocolate for Anja. He sent a photograph of himself in a suit with a tie that knotted like a fist. He received a photograph of Anatoly, older, in a suit that looked like a uniform without epaulets. The back of the photograph had a note, "Be kind." It was signed by Marta. Schoolbooks in West Germany simplified the Nazi period to keep up with growth. They emphasized bombings and expulsions, suffering that could be owned without embarrassment. They taught the Führerprinzip as a warning against charismatic men. They drew a timeline that moved briskly from 1933 through catastrophe to 1949, then lingered among economic graphs that rose like applause. Karl knew those graphs told a truth and hid others. His factory hired a man who had been a party member and who had beaten a Jewish foreman in 1938, and who now organized Christmas parties and always had cigarettes. He was useful. The mathematics of usefulness is always more persuasive than the mathematics of ethics in a shop where the presses must run. He visited museums that put the war behind glass. He read magazines that ran long features on the airlift and the expellees, with photographs of women with shawls and children with wide eyes. He noticed the absence of names for perpetrators. He noticed the abundance of passive verbs. He noticed how the "they" of the past softened into "we," and how "we" suffered, and how "they" did not. The postman brought a letter in August 1961 that weighed almost nothing. It contained one sentence: "They have closed the city." The Berlin Wall rose in a weekend. The mathematics of division was now the geometry of concrete and barbed wire. Karl could not send stockings. He could not send chocolate. He could not go and see the man who would become his stepfather, stand by a window and smoke the cigarette he was not supposed to smoke. He kept working. He kept his notebook. He wrote about maintaining machines and about mending silence. He wrote about how the West German state passed a law that reintegrated civil servants dismissed in the late 1940s under denazification because they were needed. He wrote about how some men called them the 131ers after the paragraph. He wrote about how the East institutionalized anti-fascism into a story that allowed men with different pasts to live as long as they said the right words. He had now lived in both stories. He had now kept a family inside both sets of parentheses. In 1968, Marta died. The letter came from a neighbor. The funeral was attended by friends and by men in suits who stood apart. Anja was somehow allowed to come to the border. She wore a dress that looked like a school uniform. She did not cross. She kissed the air. She said, "We are fine." Karl believed half the sentence, the half that made it to him. In 1974, a brown envelope arrived from the East with many stamps. Inside was a photograph of Anatoly in a coffin. He had a Hero of Labor medal on his chest. He looked like a man who had slept through artillery. He looked like a man who had already been buried by his paperwork. Karl sat with the photograph a long time. He put it on the table next to his father's letter from 1942. He looked at the two men who had made his life and felt the mathematics of guilt and gratitude cancel each other out, and the remainder be a single word: obligation. In the later 1970s, Ostpolitik allowed visits. Karl went to Leipzig with a special permit. The city had changed and not changed. The buildings still smelled like coal dust and boiled cabbage. The wall had turned the crowds inward. Anja met him in a cafe that had cups in a locked cabinet. She took him to the apartment on Bruderstrasse. The stove was the same, upgraded, but the wall where he had written his 18 lines was new. The old wall had been taken down and replaced with a wall that held heat better. He felt the absence of his own handwriting like a theft and like mercy. Anja told him of school lessons about anti-fascism and of parades about peace. She told him about the neighbors who told stories, then paused and looked at the door. She told him of the man on the shop floor who had been in a special camp and who spoke like a man who had swallowed a secret and could not digest it. She told him she didn't remember their father-shaped man without his boots. She told him he had been gentle and distant for decades. She told him he had been careful until he was a habit. After 1990, all the papers came out. Karl read his Stasi file. It had 3 volumes. It had entries with dates and his name spelled correctly. It had a note that he was politically unreliable and economically essential. It had notes about his letters sent via a cousin of a cousin. It had a photograph of him crossing a street with a bag of oranges. He read Anatoly's file. It had fewer pages and more redactions. It had a photograph of him in 1949 standing with a German plant manager and a caption, "Reliable." It had a report about a meeting on 17 June 1953 typed with an irregular ribbon. It had signatures of men who had also stayed. He went to the Bundesarchiv in Berlin and asked for Spruchkammer files. He read the one for his father's boss and for his father's neighbor. He read the categories and the verdicts. He read the logic of how a murderer can be made into a follower by the needs of a city. He looked at the statistics for the West and the lists for the East and watched them become one document in his mind. In both systems, the mathematics bent toward the mean. The mean is called normal life. People need normal life. You can survive an untruth if it arrives with hot water and a stove that lights. He visited Buchenwald. The gate with iron letters was a museum now. The Soviet special camp was now a plaque with numbers. He watched a school group move through the rooms, reading in whispers as if volume could offend the dead. He read, "Have to be precise numbers printed on boards. 56,000 died here by 1945. 7,000 died here by 1950. He felt nothing and everything. He could not fit both sets of numbers in his chest. He wrote in his notebook, "Arithmetic is not morality, but we try to do morality with arithmetic because we can add." He met a Polish man at a conference about forced labor. The man read a paper and then read names. He read 17 names. They had worked in a factory near Leipzig in 1944. The man thanked Germans who had come and Germans who had not been born in 1945. He handed Karl a pamphlet with dates and reparation claims. Karl did not say the thing that lived under his tongue, that his family's survival had been purchased with a Soviet uniform and with their refusal to inventory its past. He did not say, "We live because I did not ask." He wrote it for himself again and again until the sentence wore down and became the shape of his thumb on the page. He gave talks at a local school in Hanover about the war, after the war, after the war. He told the students about ration cards and cigarettes. He told them the math of scarcer food in the winter of 1946-47 and about the math of suddenly filled shops in 1948. He told them that reconstruction is not a moral award. It is a policy and a practice and the question of who gets to sit at desks. He told them about the way denial can be printed on cheap paper and issued to schoolchildren. He did not tell them about the way the man who ate at his table came from a column of tanks and returned to a desk to write other men's fates. He did not.